Peterson. I am a professional language creator. Just to kind of give you some background, I was not actually interested in language in high school, so I am super impressed by all of you, or at least not at the beginning. I became interested in language very, very late, when I was 17 years old. And I literally just woke up one morning and felt intense jealousy that there were so many millions of people that spoke French and I wasn't one of them. And so I resolved to learn every language on the planet that day, but I was a junior in high school by that time. Anyway, so I went to UC Berkeley, where I got a BA in English and a BA in linguistics, and I also studied several languages, among them Arabic, Russian, French, Esperanto, and Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs. I got my BA there, and then I got a master's in linguistics. And then starting in 2009, I started working on Game of Thrones as a language creator. And I've gone on to work on many other shows, some of the shows and movies. Some of the ones that you might know are, so Game of Thrones on HBO, The 100, which was on the CW. I worked on 2 of the Marvel movies, Thor: The Dark World and Doctor Strange. I worked on Netflix. I worked on The Witcher and Shadow and Bone, both of which are out now. And I also got the opportunity to work with other amazing conlangers on a couple of other projects, including working with Christian Talman on Shadow and Bone, and working with Jesse Sams on Motherland Fort Salem, whose second season is coming, I believe, June 22nd on Freeform. Anyway, so that's me. But yeah, you can ask me questions about anything. It can be about language. It can be about college. It can be about linguistics. It can be about my work. It can be about Southern California. It can be about ice cream. I know a lot about ice cream. So yeah, just whatever you want. Floor is yours.
All right, we can start off with Akshay.
Yeah, hi. Hi, everyone. Hi, Peter.
Hi there.
Hi, so my first question is, how does Dothraki form part of the upcoming GOT prequels? Because based on what I read in Fire and Blood, there isn't much of the Dothraki. There are people who speak Valyrian, but there isn't much of the Dothraki.
Yeah, as far as I know, it seems unlikely that there would be any Dothraki in House of the Dragon based on what I know about the plot. So I am working on House of the Dragon, and I'm very excited to be working on that. And I'm doing a lot with High Valyrian. But that's because it's directly relevant to the plot. There are a lot of characters who speak the Valyrian language. Yeah, I mean, it takes place in Westeros, remember, and it takes place in Westeros before all the action of Game of Thrones. And if you recall, the reason that we saw so much Dothraki in Game of Thrones was because we were over on the other continent, where there were, lots and lots of Dothraki speakers. Now, it's not like there are none in Westeros. It's just a question of, do they factor into the story? I remember there was one in the Song of Ice and Fire novels, Zolo, who was a part of the Bloody Mummers, if I'm remembering right. And so he's kicking around over there, but it's just like, one guy, and he mainly speaks the common tongue with everybody else. So yeah, for this particular prequel, I mean, I have to think it's probably not likely that we would see any Dothraki. But, it's a big universe. So depending on, what else comes like in the future, there might be a future for Dothraki. But yeah, like right now, Valyrian is taking center stage.
Right. So thank you. My next question, how different was your experience coming up with Valyrian compared to Dothraki?
It was quite different. It was a little more usual, I want to say. So for Dothraki, a couple of things were very different. One, there was a lot of material, comparatively speaking, in the books, much more than there was for Valyrian. So I had full sentences. I think there were 56 words and names all put together. And so it really was kind of fleshing out what George R. R. Martin had done. With High Valyrian, there were a lot of names, and that was nice. But really, there were two sentences, Vala Morjulis and Vala Dohairis, and of course, they're very similar. And then aside from that, I think there was a theory that the word Baigi came from High Valyrian, and there was the word Valonkar, which meant little brother. And then that was really it, So I don't know, like it was, for the most part, I was just creating the language on my own, while at the same time trying to make it match, the very scant material that was available. So I don't know. Creating High Valyrian felt more usual to me for that reason. For another reason, Dothraki, of course, was created for a competition. And so I was creating my version of it, and like 30 or so other conlangers were also creating their version of it. And it was on demand, and it was with the specifications of others, not just the producers, but the people that were running the contest had some input on it. For example, that's why Dothraki has a formal second person pronoun, which honestly, I am not too, if I were just doing it on my own, I wouldn't have done that. But they said that we had to, so I did it. Whereas with Valyrian, it was just me on my own timeline, or rather on, like they needed it done by a certain time, but otherwise it was just me on my own. So yeah, the processes felt very different, even though I was using the same source material.
So it was purely yours and your team's imagination on High Valyrian.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, David, big fan. So my question is more about like general conlanging, and specifically when you're working with like a script. So how much of the language creation happens before you're actually handed a script, and then how much of the language creation comes from the translation process, and how does the translation process work usually?
Yeah, good question. So there are a couple of different ways to answer that question, or ways to think about it. So first, ideally, and I really mean ideally, ideally you would have a language completely finished before you ever start translating. That's the best way, hands down. In practice, that rarely happens because you just don't get enough time to do it. Like I would love 3 months lead time. I don't always get 3 months lead time. Sometimes it's as little as 10 days. So I mentioned that I was working on the show Motherland Fort Salem. And part of the reason actually that I kind of came up with the idea to hire somebody was because the time frame was going to be extremely short. Basically, we had about 10 days to create the whole language and to deliver our first dialogue. And honestly, I just didn't feel up to it on my own. I needed help. And so I put out a call, and yeah, there were a ton of good conlangers that applied. But I absolutely got the best in Jesse, whom I mentioned. And we were able to put together something that we were both really proud of in literally 10 days. Not that it didn't need tweaking after that, and not that we necessarily remembered everything that we did, because there's creating and then there's documentation. And the thing is, if you don't have perfect documentation, you can often forget what it is that you created. And so documentation is absolutely key. But yeah, ideally, if you have the choice, you create the entire language first. And I mean, in the best of all worlds, you don't have to create a single word when it comes to script translation. And that's happened for me a couple of times. Like season 2 of Game of Thrones, I didn't need to create a single word of Dothraki for the translation that was required. I mean, I did just because, these are my languages and I like, playing with them. So I like to have fun with them. But for the script itself, didn't need anything. Most of the time, what happens is, I spend a few months working on the language. I create as much vocabulary as I can. Sometimes but it's rarely enough, because of course you have to anticipate what you are going to be translating, and you can't always do that. If if it's an adaptation of a book series, you can guess, right? Because you can look at the books and see what seeds there are and just guess the type of dialogue it's going to be there for those scenes, but you don't always know. The reason that you do this is because word creation it's a skill, and it takes time to do it right, especially if you're creating a naturalistic language. And so the best way to do it is to just sit down and do it and think about nothing else, and you're just focused on creating these words in the best way possible, giving them, unique and interesting etymologies. If suddenly you have this second task where it's like you're translating these lines, and not only are you translating these lines, but they need to be done by X date because the actors need them, there's a lot more pressure. And so you might not be able to do your best work, which is always a shame. I mean, it happens because it's Hollywood. For language creation, and I do want to emphasize this, the best work is done without a deadline, which means that the best conlangs are not going to be the ones that are created for TV shows and films, because they have hard deadlines. Not only that, you also have to sometimes compromise with people that don't know a thing about language. And so you have to do things with the language that you wouldn't do just because you're a part of a team. Which is fine, because everybody who's working on a TV show and a film makes compromises. But what it means is that the language might not be as interesting as that language creator could have made it. And that goes for everything. So anyway, so that's kind of what it's like. It's like I get as much time to work as I can. I get as much lead time as I can to just play with the language and work on it my own way, and create as much vocabulary as I can. But at a certain point in time, scripts start coming in and they need to be done. And so if you need new words, you create new words. Hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Hello. I was wondering, how do you integrate the context of the speakers and the culture of the speakers with the form and sound of a constructed language?
Okay, so the culture of the culture of the speakers of a language is most directly relevant to the vocabulary, to the lexicon in general. It's not relevant at all to the sound of a language, and it's also not relevant to the grammar of a language. We often get this impression because it's really what it is. It's just cultural stereotyping and linguistic stereotyping. We get the impression that a culture that's like this should have a language that sounds like this because we're used to languages that sound like that in our world, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the case. And the same goes with grammar. So really, you always have the culture in mind when you're creating a language for a group, but it doesn't inform any choices I make in the sound system, and it doesn't inform any choices I make in the grammar, because it's really not appropriate. That's not the avenue for it. Where it really shines, where it really shines through is in the lexicon, both in what words there are, how they're derived, like how the words themselves come to be, what their etymologies are, and also in the idioms. Because you might think, it's crazy that, they do this and still have idioms like that. But it really happens. It really 100% happens. So it also depends on kind of like the history of those speakers and which cultural influences are playing the biggest role at which times. So for example, if you think about English, kind of like the dominant English for many years was from England, And then the dominant English was really from America. And so if you start looking at idioms and expressions that have come to be, the older ones are probably going to be chiefly English, and the newer ones, a lot of times, are American. So one that you might not know the history or etymology of is we have this expression to cut to the chase. This actually comes from the golden era of Hollywood, when they would make even silent pictures, and basically it's like the producer or editor or whatever, he's looking at what has been filmed, and he sees, okay, this scene is getting a little long, the audience is going to get bored. Cut to the chase scene, the scene where somebody's chasing somebody else. We need some action here. Otherwise, the audience is going to lose interest. And suddenly, now we have this expression, cut to the chase, and it's just in our language forever. Everybody knows it. Everybody uses it. And the thing is, this is key too. You don't actually have to know the etymology to use it. It's just, if you're creating the language, right, then you need to know it if you're going to build it in there, because that's where it comes from. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, just because we have this idiom in English, that all English speakers are just, 100% focused on Hollywood and glitz and glam. It's like, no, that's where the expression came from. And now it's just a simple, banal fact of life for English speakers that most people are totally, like, the circumstances of which people are totally unaware. And so that's kind of what you're doing as a language creator. You're delving into the histories of those speakers, figuring out what were the biggest cultural moments, what kind of expressions and words might have come from those cultural moments, and then what would they mean now? And then, of course, there's a separate question of, like, are the speakers even aware of it at this point? For some things, yeah, sure. For some things, probably not. So, and that's the type of thing that changes with every single generation, So yeah, that's where culture comes into play.
Hi, is there a fictional language that hasn't been made into a conlang that you would like to create?
Oh yeah, so easily, and this is the easiest choice for me, 100%. I would have loved to have been involved with Avatar: The Last Airbender from the beginning. I think it's one of the best series I've ever seen, and not only that, the world building is so complete, and the origins of those languages would be so obvious that it was just like, oh, why couldn't there have been a language creator involved with that? And it would have been just an amazing project to be able to, like, craft, like, a very old, like, earth language, fire language, water language, and air language. And then tracing those languages throughout their history, seeing them at one stage in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then seeing them at a totally different stage in Legend of Korra. And then, like, having them branch off into different dialects, say at the Last Airbender stage. And then they are full-on different languages by the time of Legend of Korra. That would have been amazing. And there could have been all of these different writing systems. It could have just been fantastic. But, of course, Avatar: The Last Airbender debuted in 2004. That's just not something that producers thought of at the time. So it's like, it's not like on them or anything. No, they never, ever at that time would have thought it. Would have thought it. That was great. Would have thought, we could hire somebody to create languages for our cultures. It never occurred to them. So it's just a missed opportunity due to time. But that, if it was done right, and if a language creator was involved heavily the entire time from the beginning, there is no doubt in my mind that could have been the greatest conlanging project, Hollywood conlanging project of all time, easily surpassing anything that has yet existed.
Hi. I just had a question about generally, what was your plan after graduating college with a bachelor's? Like, did you know you wanted to do the master's program, or were you considering your options? Like, what careers could you have with a degree in linguistics? Like, what was your thought process at that point?
When I came into college, I had a very specific plan. I was going to major in English. I was going to get my credential to teach high school English. And then I was going to write fiction during the summer while being a high school English teacher. Linguistics was fun, so I added it as a second major. And it continued to be fun, but I still considered English my serious major the entire time. And I actually found a program to become, an English teacher that I was applying for. But then I met a girl in linguistics, and she was going to grad school, and so I thought, and so I just decided to apply to grad school in linguistics instead. I will say something that was a huge, this was a non-insignificant factor in my decision. Was I am somebody who likes to wake up between 10 and 11 a.m. or sometimes as late as noon, and not to really get my day started until like 2. And I had set up all my college classes to be that way. Like after freshman year, I never took a class that met before 11 a.m. I take that back. I never had a class that met before noon because I was like, why? Why would I do that? There's no reason. And so something that was actually a serious contributing factor was I looked ahead at being an English teacher at the high school level. And I was like, I can't do that. I can't wake up at like 5 or 6, 5 days a week. I can't do that. I don't want that. And so, linguistics grad school seemed like a pretty good place to just cool my heels for a bit. And it was, by the way, at that time, at least, it didn't, if you got into a program like that, which I got into UC San Diego, you didn't pay for it necessarily. They paid you to be there. And so I was there for like two and a half years, really. And it was great. It was a really good place to write out the financial crisis, because this was 2003 to 2006. And there weren't any jobs. And so, but then after that, it was never really my plan to actually go to grad school in linguistics or to finish it. That wasn't something that was a burning desire. I enjoyed it and I learned a lot. And in fact, I think that there were some instrumental things that happened there, some instrumental classes that I took that fundamentally changed the way that I create languages and helped me advance beyond the level where I had plateaued in undergrad. So it was an absolutely vital and crucial part of my development as a language creator. Even though that wasn't like the main purpose. So I definitely do not regret it. It was a wonderful experience, and I got a master's. I do regret a little bit not getting a PhD, even though I would have hated that, just because if you have a PhD, you could just go be a professor somewhere. Sounds so cool. Anyway, but yeah, after that, I had a BA in English and a master's in linguistics, which meant that I could teach English at the community college level. And I thought that was the perfect solution because I wouldn't have to wake up every single day, like early in the morning, and I would just get to teach, and it would be, adult students, and it wouldn't be as much work, and I wouldn't have to do research as if I were a professor at a research university. What I didn't realize was that, first of all, it's hard to live on $18,000 a year, which is what I was making. And second, oh my God, there is just so much work outside of the classroom. I mean, I assigned 2 essays a week, and then I was teaching 2 classes, each of which had 30 people. And then there were 4 papers on top of that. So you can just do that multiplication in your head. And it was like, I get home and I'm like, oh, I just need to start grading and keep doing it every day forever. So that wore on me. But like, it wasn't really like a plan. It was more like, okay, well, grad school is done. This is something that I can do. And so I did it. And then I did that for 2 years. And then after that, I took some time off to finish a novel that I was working on. I decided that I didn't want to try to publish it because I didn't like it at the end of it. And so then I just had nothing to do for a few months. And that was when the Dothraki job came along, the Dothraki competition. So I would love to say that I had a really well thought out plan and I followed it. And I could say, and if you follow that plan, you will have success too. But no, it was much more happenstance, I'm afraid. And a lot of just random stuff that just happened. And there was a lot of luck. I will say that one thing, though, is that for each of these stages, I had achieved certain things that allowed me to have a good fallback. So it's like having the BA in English and linguistics, crucial. If I didn't have that BA in English, like if I had just switched majors rather than double majoring, I couldn't have taught at the community college. Same thing, if I hadn't finished the master's, I wouldn't be able to teach at the community college. And then if I hadn't saved up money, I wouldn't have been able to take time off for writing. I would have had to have found something else. If I hadn't gone to graduate school, I wouldn't be as good a conlanger. I probably couldn't have won that Dothraki competition. So it's like there's stuff I did along the way that was instrumental in helping me get to where I'm at, but it was not a plan. So, sorry. Honest answer, though. Yes. Oh.
And that was to me to ask the question, right? Yeah, so a more fun question about conlang again. What are your favorite texts to translate into conlangs to flesh them out? Or like what types of texts for conlangs?
Type of text? That's an interesting question. You know, in the early days, we always did what do you call it? The Babel text, which was a terrible text. I don't know why we chose that one to like be our translation thing. It's got a bunch of weird words in it that you'll never use. Like if you go through older conlangs, and I mean conlangs from like the period the 90s and the early 2000s, you'll find that all of these languages have words for mortar. And it's like, what the hell is this? It's like, well, it was a word that you needed for translating the Babel text. And that's the only reason that they have it. They had to translate that text and then the word just sits there forever. It's so funny. You go through all these old conlangs like, oh yeah, there's the word for mortar. I know why you have that. There were a lot of people that translated the North Wind and the Sun. I don't know why. I never got into it. I'm sure I translated it once, but nah, I don't know. It just wasn't my thing. There are a lot of people that did in the early days the Lord's Prayer. I wasn't into that. The hard one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that one I always wimp out on that one because like one of the words that you need for that is brotherhood. I think brotherhood or fraternity or something like that, and it's like I don't want to think about how to do that. I don't want to. I don't want to have to decide if my culture like went through a really big misogynistic stage or not. Like I'd rather just do something else. So, I mean, for me, a lot of what I would do is like I'd work on a language and I'd work on it for a while, and then I'd think of a project that I wanted to do with it. So like a story I wanted to write, maybe a poem I wanted to write, an art project. And that would be the thing that I would do. So rather than translating something, it'd be like writing something, you know? Yeah, you can see, You can see an early one that I did for my very first language on my website. Here, I'll type this in the chat. You go to, there you go. If you go there, you'll see my language Meg Davy, and it's an essay about essentially why it's a really bad language. But one of the thing that I did with that is I created a picture book that was supposed to be kind of like evocative of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, and it was illustrated and the whole story written at that. And I wrote it. I did the whole book for my girlfriend at the time because the language was halfway named after her. It was a bad present because it was kind of like, I don't know, like if you're a sports guy, like, happy birthday, honey. Here's 2 tickets to a Dodger game. And you're like, oh, I don't really like baseball. It's like, oh, that's a shame. Can I take my buddy Sal? It's like that type of a present. Anyway, but you can look at it, and that's just that was just one of the things. That was just like one of the projects like I was talking about. I've had several different projects for earlier languages, and now, of course, the project is whatever the show or film I'm working on. So that's the end stage. Yeah. Anyway.
Hello, thank you very much. David, my question is actually about the process of creating a language. For example, I wonder if you create the structure first, how does it go? What's the process? Could you please elaborate on that?
Yes. Give me one second. First, there's no right way to create a language. You can start anywhere, and many different conlangers will start in many different places. I start in a place that I think is one of the more popular areas to start, at least for a certain type of conlanger. I start with the phonology because phonology is pretty easy to me. It comes naturally, and it helps to solidify things. So I create the entire phonological system first. Stress, intonation. Sometimes I'll create fake words to see like about how it's sounding. Create a fake sentence, test it out, and things like that. Then after that, I move on to grammar. And with grammar, I usually start with nominal morphology because it's easier and tends to be more stable than verbal morphology. So then I basically just go through bit by bit. I make sure that the nouns are all set. And then from the nouns, I move on to the verbs. From the verbs, I'll move on to other parts of speech that might be necessary, whether they're, adjectives, adverbs, demonstratives, adpositions. I did want to mention, as you move on, it might trigger revision in earlier stages, and that's fine. So it's like, as you're working on your nominal morphology, you might decide that some of the things you did in the phonology just aren't working, so you go back and revise. As you start creating verbs and you start putting together sentences, you might see that some of the nominal stuff isn't working, so you go back and revise. You always go back and revise the whole way. But yeah, then you just kind of methodically go through the grammar, go through parts of speech and all their morphological stuff, then move on to sentence structure and start with basic sentence structure, then move on to complex sentence structure. So things like relative clauses, subordinate clauses, coordination, negation, things like that. And then after that's all kind of set, you can move on to the you can move on to the lexicon, but also derivation in between, how you get your words and things like that. And then at each stage just triggers more and more revision. And so like you go back and revise the whole way. Sometimes you revise very, very late. Harder to do that with a TV show when it's like, stuff is already aired. But in ordinary circumstances, yeah, you can revise stuff very, very late, go through, do a whole teardown. Some conlangers who work on one language their entire life, the language ends up going through several serious stages of revision. So it'll be like it's one way until they're like 16 years old. Then they just completely tear it down and redo it. And then when they're in their 20s, they do it again. And then when they're in their 30s, they do it again, and so on. As they mature as language creators. But in general, that's the way that I go about it. What was I going to say? Things like numbers, it's like actual number systems, or like ancillary can come in whenever. And also the writing system is something that either comes at the beginning when I'm doing the phonology, or later on after I've like moved on to the lexicon and I can go and start worrying about that. So that's pretty much how I do it.
Thank you. Kat, you can ask your question.
Hi, I'm also a huge fan, just wanted to say that. But I was wondering, how important do you find it as a language creator to make your language fit into universal grammar, or to like have structures that are attested in natural languages? Or is it more just about like creativity for you? And also additionally, do you ever make analyses for your languages, like syntactic trees or phonological rules? Or you just sort of make the system and don't really go further than that?
So first with universal grammar, I've never bothered about it. I kind of think of universal grammar as something on par with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. That is, it's more science fantasy than science. And it's not really something that's useful for conlanging. And then I think that it's also really key to draw a distinction between analysis and creation. Because analysis has its place, but it's really like the type of thing where it's like, well, that's more what somebody else does with your language when you're done with it, you know? And so I look at it this way. If I'm creating a naturalistic language, then what I want to do is I want to try to emulate the process by which our natural languages are created. And the theory is, at the end of it, it should be basically a natural language if you did it right. And so then after that, it really doesn't matter if you create something that doesn't exist in any natural language. It just means that it doesn't happen to have existed, you know? It's not, I don't know, it's not really crucial, I think, that you be beholden either to linguistic universals, to universal grammars, or anything like that. When it comes to rules, though, so there's two different ways of looking at that, because a lot of phonology rules are actually descriptive rules, right? And they are, there's more of a realistic experiential base for both historical sound changes and synchronic phonological rules than there are for syntax. Because it's like we actually can work with the anatomy in the vocal tract and see that this is why this is happening. So it's like with epenthetic stops, it's like, it's not as if like a rule that inserts epenthetic stops. It's not like as if that's some sort of a theoretical mechanism or it's an analysis of a language. This is something that you could actually demonstrate why it happens specifically if you know the anatomy of speaking. Now, it's a separate thing whether speakers will notice, right, that an epenthetic stop has happened, and will treat it as a part of the language. Like, think about in English the name Thompson, right? It's just from Tom's son. That's the etymology of it. There's no P in there. But clearly it happens enough that English speakers have latched onto it, and so go ahead and spell it with a P, and so it's like a thing, you know? So that's something where I think the language creator can decide how much of a role it will play, right? But other than that, like, hopefully, and seriously, this is the hope, all of the phonological rules that you are creating will be based on, the sound science of phonetics, whether it's production or acoustics that's causing the change to happen. With syntax, I am much more leery, because with a lot of syntactic analyses, what I have seen is that, no language can do this. And then here's a language and it does that. It's like, okay, it can do that. And then here are a bunch of rules I'm inventing for why it can do that. And so these rules have to be in place in order for this thing to happen. And then another language comes by and it's like, well, here it happens again, but those rules don't apply. And so then it's like, oh, that's because there are also these meta rules that apply to this one. It's just like, that's not useful to a language creator. That is something that, people can do with your language when it's done on their own time. And they can come to their own decisions. They could say, well, this doesn't have the EPP, so therefore it's not a real language. It's like, I don't care. I liked creating it. I like using it. Other people like it. So, be mad about it, I guess. Anyway, so that's kind of like where I sit in terms of like, theory and stuff.
So when you're communicating with like your professional conlanging, like employers, the media, the writers, whoever's your boss in the job, what types of things do you think they respond best to seeing? Like for proposals, when you're applying for a job with them, or just like showing them your progress, I guess? How much technical linguistic terms do you give them, and how much translations? Like, what do you give them that they like to see, do you think?
It really depends. It depends on the person. It depends on the job. It depends on why they're hiring you and what they're interested in. Because there will be a number of them in Hollywood that just, they don't care about the details. They just want to make sure that you get it done. And so that's, and that's fine. There are others who care a little bit more, who want to be sure that you're actually doing the things that that you've asked them to do, right? I'm sorry, the other way around, that they've asked you to do, because they actually, care a little bit, like, I wanted to have this particular type of a grammar or whatever, or this particular. Well, I mean, sound. Well, let me back up. They always care about sound. So that's the thing I do first. I make sure that they are happy with the sound, and that then that I can move forward essentially. But like when it comes to grammar, like they rarely care. So, the way that it most often goes is that you have conversations with them at the beginning. And this is with the people that are like the showrunner or the director or whatever, right? You have conversations with them at the very, very, very beginning. And really all you're doing is you're just instilling in them the confidence that they need to have in you to do it, right? So you just need to basically find out what they want, make sure that you can do it, and then tell them that you can do that in a way that's going to make sense to them. And that will, everybody has different levels of expertise and different levels of how much they care. But at the end of the day, what's going to be happening more often than not is that you're going to be communicating with probably one person, and that one person is probably going to be a script coordinator. And so you're not really going to be talking to the showrunner or creator a whole bunch. And they're not going to be like micromanaging you or like reviewing your work. it may come up where it's like, you translated some line and they're like, oh, I just don't like the way this sounds. And then you just got to go back and do something different, right? To make sure that they're happy with it. Because, I mean, that's the bottom line. Just need to make sure that they're happy with it. If they're happy with it, then they're happy with it. But yeah, no, like those initial discussions, though, it's really more they're getting a feel for you, that you are going to help them achieve their vision, because ultimately that's why you're being hired, to help them achieve their vision. And that you're going to be able to do it in a timely manner, in a way that makes sense to them. And basically that what's in their head is what's going to come out. But yeah, rarely do linguistic details creep in here, or at least no more than I think they would find, like if they would find it exciting, then you tell them. Sorry, I've said a bunch of stuff. Does that actually make sense? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Just want to make sure. All right.
Akshay again.
Hi, sorry. One second. Yeah, so the entire time I was listening to you, I was like, where are the GOT fans at? None of the questions are GOT. So, here's another one.
Okay.
Will we see other Targaryens commanding their dragons in High Valyrian, as opposed to the idea of using whips in the book? Like, will we have more of those Dracarys moments?
So, of course, working on the show, I am under a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't tell you about details of the actual script. But I mean, I don't know, if I were looking at a show like that, I don't think I would be surprised if something like that were to happen.
Right. I actually have one more. You said you base your languages, the ones you create, on pre-existing languages. So
wait, no, I didn't say that.
No, but you must derive your structure from somewhere.
No.
So that it's relatable. Like somebody asked you if you could structure your language around a structure of a pre-existing language.
Yeah, I don't do that.
So you so there are no languages you take inspiration from?
I mean, I used to, and so it's like, but no, honestly, no, not anymore.
Thank you.
Let me try to give you a fuller explanation that will hopefully help to illustrate this. Let's take a very, very small decision. If your language has a distinct category for adjectives, not every language will, but if it does, then you have to decide, are adjectives going to come before or after the noun?
Right.
You can split the languages on Earth down the middle, and it's like 50% have this and 50% have that. Honestly, more have them come after, but it's like, yeah, English, it's the black cat. In Spanish, el gato negro, the cat black. So then you sit down with your language and you make a decision. Where is the adjective going to come? It didn't necessarily have to be because, well, it'll come after it because that's the way Spanish does it, or it'll come before because that's the way English does it. It's really only one very small decision. And no matter what choice you make, that choice is going to be like thousands of languages that exist on this planet. But that's not why you made that choice. You made that choice because you're creating the language and you decided this is where I want the modifiers to be. And then with every single other choice in a language, you can do the same thing. There are overriding factors that can sometimes guide you, but these are historical factors. So for example, often if you're talking about, are your adjectives going to agree with your nouns? Many languages where the adjectives agree with nouns, the category of adjective ultimately derived from something that was quite nominal. And so the reason that there's agreement is because it was kind of like saying Oedipus the king. They're both nouns, and they're both going to be the same, they're both playing the same grammatical role in the sentence, and they both refer to the same thing. So of course they're both going to have the same morphology. Imagine if instead of saying Oedipus the king, you said like, the king, the big one, right? Well, if the king is the subject of the sentence, so is the big one. If it's the object of the sentence, so is the big one. And so suddenly these things are agreeing by taking the same case because they were both nouns and they happen to be in the same position. And if there is gender, right, then they would be agreeing as well, because it would be like, say you had masculine, feminine, neuter. Well, the big one, what? The big masculine one, if you're talking about a king. The big feminine one, if you're talking about a queen. The big neuter one, if you're talking about a toaster. And so it's like, that's why these things are agreeing, because of their history, because of where they came from. And so because of that, you might find yourself making decisions because of the history of your own language. So why are adjectives coming after nouns? They're coming after nouns because they used to be nouns and they were kind of just like an afterthought, like almost an anti-topic, where you said, this is the thing and this is something else about the thing. And that's why they're in the position that they're in. But at no point in time do you have to make reference to another language. You can if you want, but you don't have to. And generally I don't, because, we're creating fantasy languages and sci-fi languages that aren't supposed to have any connection to the languages on Earth, so why would they? So hopefully that explains things a little bit better.
It does. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, probably the most boring question, but what advice do you have specific to high schoolers interested in linguistics, conlanging, or both?
If you're interested in linguistics, then really there's nothing for it but to go major in linguistics out of college. So if you're looking at colleges, you can always self-study, and honestly Wikipedia is great, and I will tell you why. It's because American linguists, American and Canadian linguists, I want to specify, have taken it upon themselves to edit Wikipedia themselves when it comes to linguistics articles. They actually have write-ins where they're like, hey, we're going to do nothing but edit linguistics Wikipedia articles. So they're actually pretty good. I think it's really cool that they took to it like that. But if you're going to college, the first thing that you want to look at, does this place have an actual linguistics department or not? It's not as if you will, for 100% get a better linguistics education at a place that doesn't have a separate department, but at least you'll know they'll have classes, right? If there's a linguistics department, there will be a major, there will be classes. All right, so that's the first thing you're looking for. If it doesn't have a separate linguistics department, does it have a linguistics program? This is something that will usually be attached to an English department, or if they have like a world languages department or something like that, it'll be attached, somewhere in there. And then if it does have a linguistics program, does it have a major? Not all will. Some will only have a minor. And so it depends, like basically if you really want to get into it, you want to be at a place where you can have a major, not a place where it's only going to be a minor and there are only going to be a few classes. You want to get the best value you can, I guess. So look for that first. And then you can start fine tuning. So for example, what interests you more in linguistics? Does it interest you more to really be at the forefront of theory, and to be learning from people that are at the forefront of theory? And for that theory, are we talking phonology or are we talking syntax? And then if you're talking one of those, like which kind of phonology? So it's like, if for some reason you knew about optimality theory in high school and you were like, this is the best thing in the world, and the place that you go is Rutgers, because that's where optimality theory was born. Though of course there are people that do OT everywhere, but it's like if you just really wanted to get the experience, that's where you would go. And then after that, you would go look at the web pages of the phonologists, because all these linguists are going to have web pages that list their interests, and go look at the phonologists at a department. So for example, if you were to go to UC San Diego, you would see that the phonology professor there, and the one that you would be taking phonology classes from, Eric Bakovich, is a big proponent of optimality theory. If you were interested in that, that might be a consideration. If you were not interested in that, then you might want to go somewhere else. So like, for example, phonology up at Berkeley, my other school, definitely not OT. You probably are not going to get much on OT at all there, at least as an undergraduate. Some other things to think about. If you find these things either interesting or not interesting, every single department in the country is going to have, like, phonetics and syntax. They're all going to have that in phonology. You'll get that everywhere. But do you want a specific theory? If so, then you go to a place that actually has people that do a specific theory. And then when it comes to the other stuff, that's where you also want to start looking. For example, are you also interested in historical linguistics? Not every department has historical linguistics. It's actually pretty rare. So if you are, you want to be sure that you're going to a place that actually has a historical linguist there on staff, and they teach undergraduate classes, because that's the other key. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, there's this amazing professor here, but it's like, he hasn't taught an undergrad class in 20 years. He's just there to do his research. So, you're not actually getting what you're expecting if you're expecting that. So historical linguistics is one. Psycholinguistics is another. You can go, and if you're interested, see where you could actually be an undergraduate and learn something about psycholinguistics. Same with computational linguistics, because again, these are things that are not everywhere. If you're interested in sign language, there will be places that will specialize in the linguistics of sign languages. So like, there is actually a dedicated sign language person at UC San Diego. There is not at Berkeley. Okay, so I said psycholinguistics, historical linguistics, sign language, computational, cognitive science. There will be universities that have separate cognitive science departments. There will be universities that have a cognitive science program within linguistics. And then there will be universities where there's one cognitive scientist that's a part of the linguistics faculty and will teach one or two cognitive science courses. If that interests you, think about how much it interests you, and kind of see what the breakdown is over there for that. And then also sociolinguistics. That's another one where it won't be everywhere. And finally, if you were interested in conlanging, not every university has a dedicated conlanging class. It's kind of rare. So, hunt around. Like there have been conlanging classes at Truman State, at Reed, at the University of Chicago, at Stephen F. Austin, at Berkeley. I taught one for a little bit. UC San Diego has one. And Wellesley has one. And a couple of others. Somebody in Ohio, wherever Nathan Sanders is, they've got one. And so if that's something that you're interested in, and that might also help to sway your decision. But this is specifically the type of search that you're looking for. Because I will tell you, just from my experience as like somebody, I was interested in coming out of high school. I wanted to write fiction. I wanted to write literary fiction. And so it's like, I looked around and it's like, oh, Berkeley has the #1 English department in the country. Obviously, that's where I should go to learn how to write fiction. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it's the #1 English department in the country because of their research. Like they have the top Joyce scholar in the country, which is cool. Very cool. And something that interested me. They had the best Shakespeare professor there. Again, also cool. Great experience. But they had 3 creative writing classes, period. They had poetry, which did not interest me. They had short fiction, which interested me. And they had long narrative nonfiction. 3 classes. That was it. Most of them sometimes were not taught every single semester. And if you wanted to get in, you had to apply. And I applied and I did get into one, and it was an amazing class, but that was it. But it's like, I did that because of Berkeley's English department and its status. I didn't actually do the research and realize that it wasn't going to be giving me what I would want. If I had gone an hour and 20 minutes east, UC Davis, whom I never considered applying to, never would have applied to UC Davis, they had a creative writing major. In fact, right next to my house, right, the college my mother went to, Long Beach State, they also have a creative writing major and 4 different emphases where you could focus on either poetry, fiction, screenwriting, or whatever the 4th one was. Maybe it was, I don't know, not technical writing, but something like that. Anyway, and it was like, it wasn't like it was a part of the English department. It was a full dedicated major just to creative writing. And that would have been incredible. Obviously, my life would have gone in a different direction, but yeah, that's the really key thing, because sometimes you can look at a university and hear some things about it and think that you're going there for that reason, and you get there and that's not actually what it is. So that's what you want to try to ferret out beforehand if you can, and you can always ask for help from somebody around. Email professors. Most of them are cool. They'll let you know. You.
And for those staying, please hang tight while we create the rooms. To make it equal, we will give each person about 3 minutes if there are 8 people. It just depends on how many people there are. We promise that all of you will get a chance to talk to Mr. Peterson, so please sit tight as Mr. Peterson will be moving from room to room.